The Failure of Burgfrieden. The collapse of Burgfrieden in 1918 had some implications on the German politics, and the most significant being the split in the socialist camp. A radical group led by Hugo Haas broke away from the SPD to form an independent Socialist Democrat Party, the USPD, in 1917. This was in reaction to the SPD's continued support for the war and the abandonment of their Marxist values. The new USPD openly called for an end to the war, repeal of the auxiliary service law and no more war credits. The Socialists were the largest political bloc in Germany at the time, and so this fragmentation would have significant consequences on Weimar itself. For example, under Weimar's new proportional voting system, this split would considerably reduce the likelihood of parliamentary majority and consequently affect the new government's ability to rule effectively, a feature that would blight Weimar throughout its use. However, Burgfrieden itself occurred in a different system with different parties than that of Weimar, and so to blame its breakdown as a root cause of the failure of Weimar would be inaccurate. Moreover, the breakdown of Burgfrieden would be inevitable, as war coalition would naturally disband after the war whatever the outcome. Therefore, Burgfrieden did not play a part in the failure of Weimar in its latter years. The German Revolution. First stage, revolution from above. New civilian government was formed by Prince Max of Baden on the 3rd of October. The Kaiser was demanded by the Allies to leave Germany as part of the terms of the armistice. Second stage, revolution from below. The Kiel Mutiny occurred on the 31st of October. Prince Max's government still loses support from the leading SPD members. As a result of this, a new government was formed by Friedrich Ebert and consisted solely of SPD and USPD members. On the 9th of November, Prince Max hands over chancellorship to Ebert and the Kaiser abdicates to Holland. Third stage, limited revolution. A deal was made by Ebert and the General Goa on the 10th of November, which ensured the new government had support from the army. Fourth stage, armistice. The new government signs the armistice on the 11th of November. Fifth stage, revolution suppressed. A communist rising by the Spartakists is suppressed by the socialist government in January 1919. The Freikorps used the opportunity to murder Liebknecht and Luxemburg, which caused severe resentment towards Ebert, the SPD, and the new government by the Marxist left in Germany. Last stage, formal establishment of the new regime. A new elected National Assembly meets the Weimar in February 1919. In Germany in 1919, a revolution led by Eugene Levine took place in Bavaria. This is known as Red Bavaria. The significance of the lack of support for Ebert's government, even on the left wing, they saw Ebert as too moderate, and so radical action appeared to be the only solution to reform Germany. This stance was replicated within Ebert's government by the USPD, who advocated the workers seizing power rather than democratic elections. Conversely, the SPD representatives held the opposite view and were supporters of the democratic elections. They were an example of working-class hostility to the revolutionary USPD. While this demonstrated a division of ideologies within Weimar, Ebert, with the support of the army and the Freikorps, was able to crush the revolution relatively swiftly. The legitimacy of the government was questioned by many of the country's elite, including members of the judiciary and the army. The lack of legitimacy may have been a source for weakness and would have been the key criticism or point for attack if Ebert's government was ineffective. However, elections to the National Assembly were positive. 85% of the eligible to vote did so, and 76% of the electorate voted for parties in favour of parliamentary democracy, 37.9% for the SPD. In comparison, the radical USPD only received 7.6%. Ebert's government, despite initial legitimacy issues and issues with the radical parties, was now on a solid foundation, and the high turnout in conjunction with the SPD receiving the highest number of votes would imply content with Ebert. A Marxist revolution had been prevented. Many radical left-wing leaders had been murdered, and despite the continuation of uprisings such as the serious disturbance in the Ruhr in 1920, communist-led Hamburg, and in central Germany in 1920, Germany did not succumb to communism, which may have been explained due to Ebert being a socialist, which meant the left wing had substantial representation. The November Criminals. The November Criminals myth was created as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. The November Criminals were so-called unpatriotic socialists who had signed the treaty and included left-wing politicians such as Ebert, Müller and Erzberger, who founded the Republic. Following Germany's surrender in World War I, the government tried its best to disgrace nationalist opponents. Therefore, the National Assembly organised an inquiry to investigate the causes of Germany's loss in the war, and wanted to make it clear to the public who they should blame and hold responsible. A simple explanation quickly spread to explain Germany's defeat. This was that the unpatriotic and weak politicians had stabbed the German army in the back and betrayed them. According to Hindenburg, when giving evidence to the investigation committee, the November Criminals were the reason that the hated Treaty of Versailles was signed, and were blamed for the stab in the back theory due to their anti-patriotic sentiments, which led to military collapse in 1918. The accusations of the nationalist right were appealing to the German public, more so than the denial of the November Criminals who had ended the war. German reaction to the Treaty of Versailles of 1919 was highly negative, and therefore there was much hatred and resentment for the November Criminals and consequently Weimar. Even though the myth is one-sided and there are many other reasons the Germans lost the war, the stab in the back theory is widely believed, enhancing the resentment of the Germans to the new Weimar Republic, and the myth posed great threat to the validity of Weimar, making it a problem they faced from the onset. The Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles had extremely harsh terms for Germany. Prior to knowing the outcome, Germany had hoped that it would be treated more leniently, based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Germany had abdicated the Kaiser on the 28th of November 1918 and begun a transition towards democracy. Therefore, at that moment in time, it can be seen that the Weimar would perhaps be successful, as Germany would adopt a democratic regime, with a treaty that would not desensitize or ruin their economic prosperity. However, the treaty was far from what the Germans had expected. Firstly, the new treaty had ruined Germany's militaristic heritage. Its military capability was destroyed. The German army was now limited to 100,000 men. The navy held only 6 battleships and was forbidden to have submarines. Secondly, Germany encountered severe territorial loss. Alsace-Lorraine was annexed and in total lost 10% of its land. Economically, it lost 60% of its coalfields and nearly half of its steel and iron industries. From the harsh treaties that the Weimar had accepted and had to deal with, the population began to turn against the democratic regime, as it could no longer provide them stability like they had under the Kaiser. Hindenburg labelled the Treaty of Versailles diktat, illustrating that the Germans were being dictated without negotiation. Although this was ironic, as Ludendorff and Hindenburg had called for the armistice, the stab in the back myth was proved to work. The myth was a consequence of the Versailles Treaty, added to the widespread socialist unrest. The newly established democratic government was forced to deal with the myth and was seen as an illegitimate government. Overall, it can be seen that Weimar was an ideological development in Germany after centuries of authoritarian rule, and much of the blame was placed on the Treaty of Versailles. Weimar was therefore a symbol of suffering and doomed from the start because of the problems it had inherited. The Weimar Constitution and democratic nature. Hugo Prius was appointed Secretary of State on the 15th of November 1918 and was responsible for drawing up Germany's new constitution. The Kaiser had abdicated after Germany had lost the war, and this meant the new state and constitution needed to be created. This was the introduction of democracy, and many people believed that the constitution was needed to make Germany have stability. And there was a shift in power from the exclusive to the Reichstag. It can be argued that the constitution did weaken the republic because of proportional representation, which meant that parliamentary governments and civil liberties were not widely represented. This resulted in dozens of tiny parties with no party strong enough to get the majority, and therefore no government to get its laws passed in the Reichstag, and ended up being a compromise between successful parties, this majority SPD, Centre Party and DDP. At no election did any of the three parties meet close to the votes received in 1919. In 1919, 23.1 million votes were between them, and this shrunk in 1928 to 14.3 million. However, the Constitution stated that all men and women over 20 were given the vote, meaning that democracy was fair on all members of the German Republic. This reflected the broader spectrum of political opinion and included nationalist right, such as the DMVP. It can be argued that the design of the Constitution was not faulted, however the mistreatment by the new state opponents was the reason it was seen as a weakness. In conclusion, the Constitution had more negatives than positives, and some of the positives of the Constitution came out of these negatives, such as it was fair and many opinions could be heard, but this meant extreme views such as fascist right-wing views could be heard and gain support. No party was ever strong enough to take the majority, so the power had to be shared between 2 or 3 parties, and overall this meant the Constitution did weaken the Republic.